Tonight, I have the honor of introducing Curt Felix, who is the Vice Chair of the Comprehensive Wastewater Planning Committee in Wellfleet, Wellfleet representative to the Cape Cod Water Protection Collaborative, and the County 208 Technical Advisory Committee, which I'm sure he will explain all of those in tonight's presentation. He has helped spearhead the town's oyster restoration and shell recycling project that includes support from the USDA, NOAA, Mass Oyster Project, Barnstable County, and SPAT. The project is restoring 140 acres of oyster habitat and supporting large-scale salt marsh restoration in Wellfleet Harbor. Part of the benefits will assist the town in meeting EPA Clean Water Act compliance through the use of natural systems, which we always appreciate at the aquarium. This project has received 2 awards, Mass Recycling Municipal Innovation and American Council of Engineering Companies Engineering Excellence Award. He is the CEO and founder of Plankton Power, an algae to biofuel company. He has worked in the petroleum industry implementing advanced capacity control in refineries and oil exploration companies worldwide. In 1995, he developed what was the largest compressed natural gas refueling facility in the county at Logan Airport, which is right across the road. His 25 years of experience in the energy industry has included roles in utility planning at the former Boston Edison Company, utility strategy management consulting, and helping to create what is now a $14.2 billion renewable and energy efficient lending program at the World Bank. Please welcome Curt Felix.
Thank you very much, Gina. And it's really a pleasure to be here tonight. I forgot about all my industry experience. Here I am talking about natural systems, and obviously my background's been in traditional utility planning and energy planning and those sorts of things for the better part of my career. But tonight we get to talk about something really fun. And before we get going, I just want to do a little bit of audience survey. First of all, how many people here like oysters? Excellent, excellent, that's terrific. How many people have heard of the Wellfleet Oyster Festival? Holy cow, that's amazing. Okay, now, obviously those are 2 things near and dear to our hearts here, but the other thing I want to try to get a sense of is the where people may have come from. So, how many people are from the South Shore? North Shore? Cape? Western Mass or Western Boston? Nice, actually very good distribution. Okay, now one other quick question. Anybody, I want to go through sort of the educational background, get a sense of who's here tonight too, because you just never know. Who here has only gone as far as high school in education? Okay, 2. College? Grad school? So about half grad school, half college. And by the way, those that have only gone to high school, you're in great company with Ross Perot, with Sam Walton, and a few others. So you're in the right category. Anyway, again, thank you all for coming tonight. Before I get going on the presentation, I also want to make just a bit of thank yous to, first of all, the New England Aquarium for hosting this. I think it's very tough for folks like me working in the oyster restoration area to sort of get why this message is important out to the public, and thank you all for coming. It's you could do a lot of other things on a Thursday evening. Some of the sponsors of this project I think are critically important. This is not just an individual effort on the part of the town of Wellfleet, although the town's been instrumental in it. The Mass Oyster Project is a sponsor that's helped us out quite a bit financially on the project. As well as NOAA, as well as USDA. We have sponsorship from the Cape Cod Water Protection Collaborative, which is a Barnstable County organization, so basically from the county itself. UMass Boston is actually doing the biological assessment work, and Anna Maria Frankich there's some slides in here to her credit on the biological assessment work. The Provincetown Center for Coastal Studies, many of you may be familiar with the Whale Watch down in Provincetown. Anybody been on the Whale Watch? So the Provincetown Center runs that, the biological work on those expeditions, and is doing the water quality assessment work for us in the town of Wellfleet. The Cape Cod Cooperative Extension is also involved in the project. And lastly, the Wellfleet Oyster Fest. SPAT has contributed money to this effort as well. And I think it really is all about the team. The reason that we're here tonight is that, in fact, about 85% of oyster habitat worldwide is essentially functionally extinct. So if you look at that map and you look at sort of the grayed out or sort of oranged out areas up there, that's former habitat that's largely gone. In the 1600s, Samuel de Champlain came into Wellfleet Harbor, sailing out of, obviously from Europe, came into Cape Cod Bay, took a left, came down probably just about where the Pilgrims eventually landed originally, looked into Wellfleet Harbor, which is a big open harbor, and made a note in his captain's log that it looked far too dangerous to go in there because there were oyster reefs sticking out of the water. So back in the 1600s, we had these massive structures that constituted what our environment, our ecosystem used to look like. Massive oyster, well, I should say large oyster reefs, extensive oyster reefs, and extensive salt marsh. In Massachusetts, we've lost probably 95% of our oyster habitat and roughly 65% of our salt marsh. And I'll get to why those are really, really important beyond just the obvious ecosystem interests in a minute.
Oysters are one of the founding blocks of the web of life underwater.
Oysters are ecosystem engineers.
One little adult oyster can filter out 50 gallons of water per day.
New York City was the oyster capital of the world.
It was estimated that half the world's oysters were in New York Harbor.
There aren't any oyster reefs left in this region at all.
85% of the historical reefs are gone.
Oyster communities around the world are functionally extinct.
Now, at this time, we're restoring something that's completely decimated.
The organisms that used to rely on oysters are also not there.
We need to stop taking away these blocks before everything crumbles.
Restoring oyster reefs is not just about oysters. It's about making it so that the organisms that have relied on oysters have the chance to survive.
What happens in the oceans happens to us.
So that's actually a little clip from a movie called Shell Shocked, which we have shown down in Wellfleet. It's just a fantastic documentary. That documentary is actually about oyster restoration in New York City. Oyster restoration is going on in quite a few places around the United States. And in Wellfleet, what we really wanted to focus on in terms of our activity was to think about what the ecosystem did look like when Samuel de Champlain came into the harbor. And our real focus from the Comprehensive Wastewater Management Committee, which is one of the things that Gina mentioned in my background, currently I serve as vice chair of that committee, we were faced with and are faced with, like many coastal communities on Cape Cod, this issue of declining water quality centering mainly around the fact that we've got lots of nutrient in the water. The nutrient feeds algae. Algae grows and there's nothing actually consuming the algae. And that algae, when it dies, causes black, what people often term as black mayonnaise, or this mucky kind of sediments in the, in the bottom of the estuaries. It takes the oxygen out of the water. It creates an environment where a lot of things can't grow anymore, and really kills off life in our estuaries. So, in terms of trying to deal with that issue, the Clean Water Act has some very specific requirements to improve our estuary water quality. And on the Cape, many people were looking at using sewer systems to do that. The assumption is that people are responsible for this nutrient that's in the water, and we somehow have to, get rid of that nutrient by sewering. So anyway, in Wellfleet, we had to kind of look at this issue more closely, and I sort of got involved in this because a scientist at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, a guy by the name of John Waterbury, was on a committee similar to the one in Wellfleet, And I had been working with him, and I said, John, you know something about this stuff. And people in town had said, in fact, my wife Suzanne, who's here in the audience, her mother said, you know something about this. You have to get involved. You have to you really have to get out there and do something about this if you know something and you have some skills and capability. And so I said to John, what do you think we have for a problem, if any? And if we do have a problem, what do you think we should do about it? And he said, well, I think you've got a problem in this densely populated area that I'll show you in a minute. And he said, I'd grow oysters. And this was about 3.5 or 4 years ago. And frankly, I thought it was a crazy idea. It just didn't quite intuitively make a lot of sense. Doing the research over the last 3.5 or 4 years, there's 25 or 30 years worth of extraordinary scientific research and support for this idea that oysters filter, as the clip said, 50 gallons of water per day. They are the water quality engineers of our ecosystem. And the fact that they're gone has had a profound impact. So as we looked at this closely in Wellfleet, we wanted to identify an adaptive approach to nutrient management, look at a holistic solution, and look at sustainable solutions, not just simply something that really maybe couldn't be sustained over the long term. Obviously, 30 years of scientific research in this area was extremely helpful to guide our sort of evaluation of this. But the other thing that became very clear was that the biodiversity of oyster reefs and salt marshes, they don't just clean up the water, but they actually provide 3D structure and habitat for fish, finfish. In fact, there are reports from NOAA and other scientific groups that point to the fact that about 80 to 90% of our commercially important fish and our recreationally important fish stocks actually depend on this oyster reef type habitat, the shelter and the feeding that can occur when they're juveniles in that kind of a structure. Obviously down in Florida, people know about reefs. They actually put man-made structures down there to create them and attract fish. And in the Caribbean, coral reefs, the main shelter habitat for the tremendous amount of fish diversity that you see down there. Well, it's very, very important here. And unfortunately, I think a lot of times fishermen get blamed for the decline in fish stocks in New England. But there's two parts to that problem. There's a left shoe and a right shoe. You can sure put, caps on fishing limits, but if there's no place for these things to spawn and to grow up, that's a very significant part of the problem. And it really comes back to these oyster reefs. In terms of what shellfish do for nutrients, they don't actually take the nutrient out of the water. What they do is they're filter feeders, just like cows would be eating grass or sheep. They actually consume the vegetation, the vegetable matter that's in the water, and filter it out, and that's how they actually remove nutrient. And in the process, they get the heart-healthy oils and fats in the oyster, so all the good stuff ends up in the oyster, and what they also process out gets rejected into the benthic material and down below. And I'll talk just a little bit here about why that's kind of important. If you look at this pie chart, this blue area is what an oyster actually takes up in its shell and its tissue in terms of nitrogen. And it's responsible for maybe about 25% of the nitrogen that's removed as an oyster feeds. The other thing an oyster does is, in the process of eating, things that it doesn't like, it actually rejects as it's called pseudofeces, and it puts a mucus around that package and actually makes those things that it couldn't eat available to other things in the water column, whether that's other organisms, animals, bacteria. But in the process, those things work on that pseudofeces package and actually create nitrogen gas that leaves the water. So an oyster actually has two mechanisms for removing nitrogen from the water, one by this gaseous process and one by what it actually consumes and eats. And it doesn't matter whether you take the oyster out of the water or not. If you leave it in the water, it will continue to remove nitrogen as it grows, as the shell gets larger, as the meat gets larger, and as the pseudofeces process goes on. But the right-hand side of that pie chart, the blue and the red areas, is only responsible for about half of what an oyster reef would remove. And I want to draw just a real clear distinction here, because the blue and the red areas here represent typically aquaculture or commercial harvest. So those things are happening existing oyster industry activities right now today. And not only that, we actually get paid, those farmers get paid as they provide that product to the marketplace. So that's a way of removing nitrogen that doesn't cost us a penny. It actually makes money. On the green side, as you begin to restore natural habitat, oyster reef, we would have to invest to restore those reefs. But as the pie chart indicates, potentially there's about twice as much nitrogen that can be removed. In addition to that, that's also the habitat that creates this hiding grounds for the fish, for fish stocks to grow up. It creates, essentially, oyster shell is like Tums. It's called calcium carbonate. It actually neutralizes water and creates a buffer in the water. Right now there's a lot of concerns over climate change and ocean acidification. So this particular structure, this habitat, getting these Tums back in the water are critically important for maintaining the proper pH in the water, which allows oysters to spawn and to grow up. It also provides habitat that mitigates the impact of waves, of storm surge. New York is actually looking at projects to potentially restore oyster reefs in the wake of Hurricane Sandy, the idea being that these waves that would come in would get dissipated. They'd break up on what used to be Oyster Reef out in New York and help prevent that kind of storm surge from getting into New York City. Whether that's feasible and possible, I don't know, but it's just another way of thinking about what our environment used to look like. In Maryland, the governor there has spent about $8 million or is committed $8 million for 2014. That's been about the kind of level of funding that they've had in Maryland for oyster restoration. And during that period of time, a couple of things have happened. One, they increased oyster sanctuaries from 9% to up to 24%, so a dramatic increase in the natural habitat. They've also expanded significantly the number of aquaculture leases and the amount of area that was open for farming oysters. About $2.2 million in financial assistance to those aquaculture interests and to their programs. About 76% of the bay still remains sustainably managed for a public oyster fishery, so for regular commercial oyster fishery. Since the implementation, they've added about 28 new oyster farming leases for about 650 acres. They've got about 52 new lease applications pending for about another 620 acres. But the interesting thing is, in the process of dramatically increasing this amount of habitat, the diseases that affect oysters and have been a plague to the industry for about the last 75 or 100 years, MSX and dermo, these disease rates have actually fallen to the lowest levels they've ever recorded. Nobody can really explain why. But one would suspect that as you restore the habitat and get this natural habitat going again, you're going to start to see improvements. The other thing that they've seen is the highest spat survival rates since 1985. Spat are those little guys that you saw in the video swimming around. That's a juvenile oyster, and that's the thing that happens after oysters have spawned, before they swim around and ultimately attach to something that they need to attach to live the rest of their lives. And that's usually shell. It's sometimes rock. They really prefer their own kind of material, which is calcium carbonate. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. Overall biomass in Maryland is up 44%, and they've just had, this program over the last, say, 7 or 8 years has been a resounding success in terms of real turnaround in the oyster industry. In Wellfleet, what we do to restore habitat is a little bit different. We have the luxury of having an actual natural spawning habitat, meaning we have oysters in the harbor that really do spawn, and when they spawn, we can actually increase the habitat by getting more substrate, by getting more shell or places for those oysters to set. And we call it culch, so it's culching the harbor. And what you're looking at in this photo is my lovely wife standing on the Wellfleet Town Pier. And the shellfish constable is standing next to a recycled sander that came off of the back of regular road sander for winter road salt. And what we did was mount this sander on the back of a barge, and it allows us to then bring shell down to the barge, load it up, drive it out to a location, start up the motor, and deposit a beautiful ribbon of shell on the bottom, which serves as the substrate for catching set. And we've used this to both expand oyster habitat throughout the harbor, as well as to concentrate on a very specific location in the harbor that we're monitoring for water quality changes. In the process, we're actually recycling a couple of different kinds of shell. We bring in sea clam shell from off Cape, and that shell is very large, looks like this. We also recycle and have an ability for anybody in the public to bring shell to our town transfer station. So if you eat oysters, you like clams, whatever, you can bring your shell to the transfer station, and we'll get that back into our program. We also recycle shell from the Oyster Fest. And we've actually recycled about 20 tons of shell over the last 3 years from Oyster Fest. But overall, the recycling operations end up being about 10 tons of shell that go into our restoration program, while we're in the process of probably getting about 900 tons from that sea clam shell that we're bringing in off Cape. So while the recycling is critically important, we've got an all of the above, all-out effort to get as much shell as we can and get it out as part of our restoration activity. Our ultimate goal here is actually to restore several areas around the harbor. Those are those blue numbered locations that you can kind of see on this slide. We're calling those propagation zones. And the idea there is that we would have an area that would not be available for harvest, that would be set up as a reserve, as sanctuary for all this 3D development and natural habitat development that would serve water quality purposes. But also think of it like putting money in a bank account. So you start a bank account, you put a bunch of money in there, and you just leave the money in that account and only harvest the principal. So as the oysters in that propagation area spawn, we will have additional shell out there that would be available for commercial harvest. And the idea here is really to try to figure out how we can make this a win-win-win, both for our shell fishermen, for our shellfish economy, as well as for water quality and all these other benefits that we talked about. The area that we've focused on to do some very, very intense monitoring around water quality is right across from the town pier. This is the town pier that you can see in the photo here. This triangular area is actually the oyster study area. It's about 2 acres. And it's at the confluence of a river up here on the left-hand side called, it's actually a creek called Mayo Creek that comes in, and another one called Duck Creek that comes in here. So it's at the confluence of 2 different creeks. And you can see some of these houses back here in a development right on the beach here. But this is actually backing up to town center. So it's got the largest density of homes, it's got the largest density of businesses, and it was the area where we actually were most concerned about the water quality potentially being adversely affected by what we're doing. On the right-hand side, you can see I'm sorry, I got a next slide here. On the right-hand side, you can actually see a sea clam shell, and those little black dots that you see are actually that's actually spat that has set on that shell. So that's natural oysters that have spawned onto those shells. And if you look at sort of the lower part, that's reef structure that's beginning to take hold in that area. To date, we've actually established about 4 million new oysters, gone from maybe a couple thousand to 4 million in this 2-acre study area in about 3 years. So a very short period of time, an amazing turnaround in that particular area. At the same time, we've seen about a 70% reduction in nitrogen, dramatic water quality improvement. And from the other shell that we've put out around the harbor, probably about 50 million oysters increase in population, about 2,000 tons of shell over the last 3 years. And we think that's probably responsible for an additional 3 billion gallons of added water filtration. And some of these numbers just are mind-boggling to me. But it doesn't take very many of these guys to make a fundamental difference. The other thing that we've seen is a big increase at the project area of other things, sea life returning. The Shellfish Constable has talked about menhaden, which we haven't really seen in Wellfleet Harbor for a long time. Menhaden are a critical bait fish for bass and other predator fish. We've seen a huge influx. In fact, Anna Maria counted about 50 or 60 diamondback terrapin turtles that literally were coming out to the site, swimming around and feeding on that area. And the diamondbacks are an endangered species. So we've seen these kind of anecdotal things, but it's just amazing how much life has been attracted to this area. As Gina mentioned, we won 2 awards, and actually just the other week we were also awarded the American Public Works Association Project of the Year for estuary water quality improvement. That was a national award, and we're extremely proud of that. Thousands of other towns that apply for that award, and this project was picked as a winner for 2014. So we're other people are beginning to take note of what's going on in Wellfleet as well. This is Anna Marie in her own words, talking a little bit about what's going on in the Wellfleet project.
Oyster reefs are one of the most endangered habitats in the world. There are only between 5 and 10% of oyster reefs left in the world. The oysters in general all over the world are in trouble because we destroy their habitat. This is the main reason that gives me hope, is this little creature that can still survive in this embayment, and it's Seven Hill Cove that is one of the most polluted embayments in Boston Harbor. In order to improve the sediment and make it possible for oysters to settle, we start culturing 2-acre propagation area with shells like clam shells to understand why those beautiful species are not just like a wonderful food and seafood support for us, for humans. Oysters are an amazing and very important keystone species for our coastal habitats to improve not only the water quality, but also to support coastal shorelines from erosion, from storms, to create engineering amazing 3D structures where different species can live.
That's her vision for Seven Hill Cove. That last piece is a rendering of what she hopes to do right here in Boston. So one of the things that I think is an interesting backdrop, this is kind of the drier part of the presentation where I get into a little bit of numbers and some data from our project specifically. There's been an increasing interest in oysters for water quality for quite some time. The Chesapeake has been working on this for about 15 years. So even though the populations have declined to about 1% of historic levels, if you look at these bars actually in this chart, this is kind of what they're expecting the Chesapeake Bay expenditure path is going to have to look like in order for them to achieve their water quality objectives. So it's a very, very steep increase in the amount of spending that they expect. On the Cape, the estimates right now are that we would spend about $4 to $6 billion if we were to go about trying to restore our water quality through using sewer systems alone. What's interesting about that is, and this particular slide is a little bit busy in terms of numbers, but I'll try to make it really accessible. We put this together because we really didn't know what we were doing when we started out, to be honest. We knew that we had, as an obligation, we had to look at doing sewer systems in Wellfleet as one option. We knew we were doing some things in terms of this top line here, this what I call the commercial harvest. We knew there's an active commercial harvest going on. And we knew that we had already started some sea clam culching efforts within our town shellfish department. And then we have a couple of salt marsh restoration projects going on. One of them down here, this Herring River salt marsh restoration, one of the largest salt marsh restoration projects in New England. It's about an 890-acre project. So we thought, well, let's just put all these projects together and kind of look at them and see what do they do for us in terms of nitrogen removal and what would they cost. So I'll focus your attention first on the sewering option, which is the traditional approach, and many communities around the country, that's the primary approach. It would cost us about $60 million to put in a sewering system that would handle that central district that I pointed out on the earlier slide, which we're using oysters for water remediation there. To sewer it would be about $60 million, and it would only remove about 450 people's worth of nitrogen. The commercial shellfish activity that we have right now in Wellfleet Harbor is bringing in about $3 million in revenue. So it's basically we're getting paid $812 a pound for nitrogen removal, just by letting the aquaculture industry do its thing. And it's also responsible for about 950, almost 1,000 people's worth of nitrogen removal. So almost twice as much nitrogen removal as spending $60 million on a sewer treatment system. The town's culching programs, where we're taking that sea clam shell and putting it out around the harbor, we estimate that that's probably responsible for about 8,000 inhabitants worth of nitrogen removal. And that's only over the last 3 years, at a cost of about 75 cents a pound for nitrogen removal. These natural approaches, and the other one that's kind of interesting is the Herring River Restoration Project, ironically about a $60 million estimated price tag, but would be responsible for removing almost 15,000 people's worth of nitrogen at about $23 a pound. So this column of natural systems, this combined approach of a lot of different elements, would be responsible for about 25,000 people's worth of nitrogen removed from Wellfleet Harbor. Guess what, folks? We have a summertime population of only about 18,000. So with natural systems, we can remove more than our summertime population. Our wintertime population is only about 3,000 people. So it's just a way of, even with just these small programs that we had going on, sort of kind of rethinking this problem, we came to the conclusion that what is obvious from some other scientific reports, that people and our nitrogen contribution, while important, isn't perhaps as important as what we did to the marine environment. So by taking away these filtration systems and taking away our natural systems that remove nitrogen has had a far greater impact on our estuaries than the people contribution. And most of the scientific studies on the Cape show that people are probably responsible on the land side for only about maybe 5 to 25 or 30%, maybe 40% of the nitrogen contribution in an estuary. And that's the high end, is where you've got a very, very dense population right on an estuary. So bottom line is, what's happened as a result of this is we've kind of turned around the process on Cape Cod. The Cape is in the process of developing a region-wide, what they call a 208 water quality plan as part of our EPA water quality compliance obligations. And in about 11 of the 15 or so watershed groups that we're looking at, how do you fix this estuary, almost all of them are now, 11 of the group, really are focusing on natural remediation as a first line of action. The other thing to keep in mind is, when you put a sewer in, if you put it in tomorrow, it's going to take about 20 to 30 years before the water that it's treating ultimately makes it to the estuary. And so the cleanup, you're going to be sitting there twiddling your thumbs for the next 20 or 30 years while nutrients continue to flow into the estuary, and without any kind of remediation. If you do the natural systems, you have immediate improvement. So from a time perspective, from a cost perspective, from a economic benefit and multiplier perspective, what became very clear to most of the watershed groups is this is something we've really got to focus a lot of attention on. But I want to throw up a caution flag, because there's a lot there. This is, even though I think the results are fairly obvious and they're intuitive, and I think people get it, it's probably going to take several, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years of persistence in terms of public interest in this to make it happen. This is not going to happen overnight. There's regulatory issues involved in terms of trying to accelerate this and get it to be acceptable by DEP and EPA. So we have a lot of homework to do, and I have a feeling that most people out here in the audience are kind of interested in this, and I hope by the end of this you'll feel as compelled to want to get involved and actually take part and be a part of what I think is going to be a lot of hard work to kind of get our environment right. I've talked a little bit already about this, so I'm going to skip over this slide, but this is just to orient you to what the Duck Creek site looks like. You saw that from Anna Maria's slide. A nod to our grad students, especially Dennis Bertuna, who's doing the biological assessment work at the site. Anna Maria and I, you can see this sea clam shell on the right-hand side of the slide with, that's typically how many oysters we'll catch on a sea clam shell. Sometimes you'll see 30, 40, 50, 60 oysters on one shell. It's really quite amazing. This slide, what's interesting to me about this is, obviously this is the sequence of what the site looked like at the outset, this top right slide. You see all that green slime that's on the slide? That's basically a classic indication of excess nutrient in a water body. That's excessive vegetative growth. That is the kind of stuff that clogs most estuaries that you see on the Cape. And that's something called ulva. It's a sea lettuce. That was the first year that we put culch down there to start to increase our oyster population. The second year, you can already see a dramatic change over here on the left. And we saw no ulva the following year. And we couldn't believe it. I mean, we're just visually astounded that we saw that degree of change. Slide over here on the right-hand side, lower right, is actually what the site looks like today. We've had some hammering from a real tough winter. It doesn't look quite as healthy as it did in 2012, but even though the look may not be quite as attractive due to the sunset, I think, on the other slide anyway, it's real healthy. We're seeing we're seeing a significant increase in biodiversity at the site. This is just kind of tracking it over time. And we're cataloging a wide variety of species that are actually coming into the site. Between 2013 and 2012, actually in 2011 we probably had about a 2 million population, so from a couple thousand to maybe 2 million. By 2012 we had gotten that up to about almost 4 million. And our population count from this past summer indicated there were probably about 4.4 million oysters on the site. Just an extraordinary turnaround. This slide is really to kind of highlight some of the work that the Provincetown Center for Coastal Studies has been doing. Amy Costa is the person that actually is doing our water quality measurements. And she does a sampling all over Cape Cod Bay in addition to the work that she's doing in Wellfleet Harbor. But what you're looking at in this slide, these dots, a red dot indicates severely impacted water. So in other words, nitrogen levels that would be classified as severely degraded and flowing into this area. When we take water quality samples, as you're looking at this slide, water flows from basically the red dots out around the pier and out into the harbor. So the same thing from this area over by Mayo Creek, water is flowing out and kind of around the point. So we always take our samples as the tide is going out with water flowing away and out into the harbor. What we found was that basically these green dots, which are actually over our oyster reef and over our propagation zone, are showing nitrogen levels that would be qualified in basically the excellent EPA water quality standard. And oddly enough, these other green dots are basically in the good range. So higher levels of nitrogen out in the harbor than actually we're seeing over the oyster reef. In essence, what we're really seeing here is like a black hole for nitrogen. I mean, significantly lower nitrogen levels in this area than anywhere else in the harbor, which is really the oysters doing their job. Looking at this slide, again, it kind of highlights these red areas are those red dot areas, and so we kind of aggregated the data here. It's just a way of indicating and showing that this red line is the EPA Excellent Water Quality Standard. So coming in from what we consider really our sources, our worst sources of nitrogen, some pretty significant nitrogen loads, but actually the oyster's getting that nitrogen load down to within EPA Excellent Water Quality Standards. In 2013, with a few more oysters and those oysters being a bit older, we actually saw almost twice the level of nitrogen coming in from our source waters, probably from much greater rainfall than we had seen in 2012. But even though we had almost twice as much nitrogen, those oysters, slight population increase and a little bit older, were still able to keep the water in that area within the EPA Excellent Water Quality Standard. To us, just absolutely remarkable. This slide's a little busy, and what it essentially shows is these red bars and these blue bars. Red bars are phosphorus in the water. The blue bars are what we call dissolved nitrogen. So that's nitrogen that would be like Miracle-Gro or nitrogen fertilizer dissolved in water in the area. And if you look at this from 2006 up till now, there's not really any difference, observable difference in the levels of phosphorus or the levels of nitrogen. There's really no trend in this particular bar graph. This one kind of blows up just the ammonia portion, which again is another dissolved component within the water. Really no observable trend there. So this is the stuff that would be available to plants that plants would use. This lower slide is actually total nitrogen. So in other words, this is after plants have used that nitrogen like algae or other vegetable matter. They've taken it up, and then the oysters have had an opportunity to consume it. And so what you see from this time series trend at these same locations is a dramatic drop in total nitrogen levels as the oysters are doing their job and taking that nitrogen out. The other thing that we measured here is chlorophyll, but I'm going to actually skip right to the next slide because I think it shows it a little bit better. So at the oyster propagation site, again, this red line is what the EPA would consider excellent water quality standards for chlorophyll. And that's just basically a measure of how much stuff is out there in the water. Think of chlorophyll as one of the things that makes the water really cloudy. Algae does that, but chlorophyll is sort of a proxy for algae and other vegetable matter out there. If you don't have light that penetrates your water, you can't get your vegetation, the things like eelgrass and the other marine grasses to grow. It's been one of the biggest reasons that our eelgrass populations have declined. No light and a lot of dredging and other activity that has ripped that particular feature out of the water. Well, that feature is also responsible for, it's a fish habitat, but mainly a scallop habitat. And it's, along with that decline in water clarity and eelgrass, scallops are rarely found in our coastal waters when they used to be ubiquitous. But again, what this slide shows is even though in 2012 we saw, kind of a very good chlorophyll level, we know in 2013 we had a much bigger nitrogen level, but the chlorophyll levels with those bigger, more mature oysters were even lower than in 2012. So a real amazing improvement in water clarity and water quality. This is a slide that basically compares the oyster site to a number of other collection locations around Cape Cod Bay, McMillan Wharf, Pamet Harbor. This is actually from Wellfleet Harbor. This is what the chlorophyll levels at the oyster site look like, compared with, say, Rock Harbor, Sassuat, Plymouth, and Duxbury Harbor. So we're seeing a dramatic improvement, again, in water quality at our location. So the big picture plan is kind of contained in this last slide here. And the green areas that you see, these little green triangles, those are areas that we're going to continue to focus on with culch, but for commercial harvest. So in other words, taking these numbered zones again, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, these are our 6, 7, these are our propagation zones, and dovetailing them with a lot of expanded shellfish, sea clam culch, oyster culch, whatever kind of culch we can get out there to improve our habitat with a goal of trying to get about 140 acres of restored habitat in Wellfleet Harbor. The yellow outlines is actually the Herring River Restoration Project. So this is an area that would be restored salt marsh and recover about 890 acres of salt marsh. This little red area is an area within the Mayo Creek. You saw that on the slide, but Mayo Creek actually has something called a duckbill where the water comes out underneath a road and it's pinched off. And so the water basically can't really flow out and it can't really flow in. It's probably one of the dumbest things I think I've ever seen in terms of engineering retrofits. It used to have a clapper valve, so the clapper valve, and the idea was that you'd let the water out, but you wouldn't let the salt water in. The theory was that the fresh water wouldn't breed mosquitoes. And it turns out that really isn't the case. But in the 1920s, that was the philosophy, and that's part of the reason that we've lost a lot of salt marsh in Massachusetts. It was a wrong-headed thinking around mosquito control. So this little red area would be about a 20-acre area restoration, And as you could tell from the red dot on the slide where you can see water coming out of that area, it's really bad. So the combination of oysters and salt marsh restoration in that area is likely to be a very good long-term solution for that inner harbor. And in line with that, that harbor is about to get dredged. And one of the reasons that you've got to dredge these harbors is because you get all this material that dies off, this vegetable matter, this black muck that accumulates. Well, if you have oysters and other filter feeder fish using and consuming that material, it's not going to fill in as quick. I mean, it's one of the main reasons that we have such fill rates in many of our harbors. And you see the harbors getting, worse and worse and worse. So we see this as another win-win strategy for once this area gets dredged, seeing it certainly not fill in as quickly over time and maybe for a lot longer than it used to. So that's kind of it. We have a lot of homework to do still with the Division of Marine Fisheries to get this plan approved. They're reviewing this, and I think we're getting closer, and it looks like they're going to approve this concept. But right now in Massachusetts, the notion of a propagation zone is actually not within, or has not historically been within, the regulatory framework. So that's a very important issue that we're working on right now from a regulatory standpoint. So that's all the boring detail. And I'm going to stop there because I think at this point it'd be great to hear comments, questions, concerns, ideas, suggestions, and anything else you might have on your minds.
Are you getting any school kids involved or any school programs?
Andrew, would you like to comment on that? Andrew J. here with the Mass Oyster Project.
We're trying to, as much as possible. The great thing about getting kids involved is if you can get them spreading shell, putting down oysters or seed oysters, is they love to be able to see all the different creatures. It's like looking at tide pools. So to the extent we can get them involved, we can. Here at the museum, or at the aquarium, I call it museum, we have supplied to the aquarium with oysters. They are now using them in their young marine biologist training program in terms of measuring at growth, looking at growth between different areas. So we're trying to get the kids involved as much as we can. We'd like to be doing a lot more, and a lot of it depends on getting permitting for permission to do that.
And I think the aquarium has an active interest in doing that. In Wellfleet, kids get out there on the flats, so it's a little different.
I had a question. What's the difference between scallops and oysters as far as environmental impact?
Oysters filter, as I said, about 50 gallons a day. Scallops, it's a much, much lower level of filtration in terms of water processing, but they're another filter feeder. Just like there's other menhaden, certain fishes also filter feed. Whales filter feed. The baleen whales are filter feeders. So just another filter feeder, another great thing for the environment.
How are you communicating the net benefit of all these projects that you're working on, like the one you're talking about in Maryland and what you're doing in Wellfleet, and how it's impacting the greater fishing community and such like that, sort of the overall economic benefit? Because there's so much great stuff that you guys are doing, and to get that communication out to make these projects more sort of globally or universally accepted, what are you doing to that effect?
How are we getting the word out about net benefit? By coming to the New England Aquarium and having this great forum where we get to talk about it. Seriously, that's how we do it. I mean, I've been involved in the Cape Cod, in the 208 water quality process. We bring in, we've provided a lot of technical information to that forum. There are many scientists in the Chesapeake Bay, NOAA, and others are publishing their scientific reports. But I'll tell you, the fish thing is a really tough one to talk about. I mean, how do you say that fish came from, that breeding zone? It's just something we know. My hope is that, we'll never have perfect answers or perfect information. At the end of the day, at some point you got to make a decision and do something. And to me, it just seems, it just seems obvious that these things are, they were once historically different. We have problems today that are related to that. Let's try to figure out how to go the other direction. And I think, policymakers obviously need that data. They need that information. So we're doing the best that we can, and there's a lot of scientific support around it.
the oysters penetrate into the salt marsh area?
Oysters love habitat that's brackish, typically. In other words, where fresh water tends to come down from either ponds or rivers, and where it meets the salt water, where it all mixes, that's what oysters love. So yes, they will migrate up into salt marshes, and they normally inhabit salt marshes quite extensively.
I know Anna Maria because she lives in Quincy and I do, and I thought she said there was some problem with Department of Public Health. They're afraid she wasn't able to put some oysters around Quincy or whatever, or Boston because of something to do with they're afraid people are going to eat them and they're not maybe healthy to eat, or do you know anything about that?
Yeah, I know a little bit about that. Basically, the water quality in Boston Harbor has a lot of issues. One of them is bacteria, so coliform bacteria, which are not good for us, and that's something that the Department of Public Health and Division of Marine Fisheries monitor. So any place that has, high levels of coliform bacteria, you can't eat the shellfish. You're going to get sick. In addition to that, in Boston Harbor, we have a legacy of a couple hundred years of it being a dumping ground for all kinds of chemicals. And so we have, within the sediments, lots of different kind of heavy metals and PCBs and other things. So there's some real serious concerns about if you put shellfish out there, where does that stuff end up? And could it potentially be hazardous to us? At the end of the day, it's one of these chicken or egg things. How are you going to recover Boston Harbor if you can't figure out how to recover Boston Harbor? So at least the inputs have been stopped by virtue of the sewage treatment systems that have been put in the Deer Island treatment plant. Everybody's struggling with how do you go about trying to take the next steps. The shell shock video in New York, they're much more aggressive. And in fact, in other areas of the country, they are much more aggressive about trying to rehabit an area that otherwise wouldn't be healthy for shellfish harvest. The challenge is, if you take an oyster out of an area like that supposedly is closed and unhealthy, and if somebody gets that oyster and illegally takes it out and it ends up on the market, and somebody says, oh yeah, I got that oyster from Massachusetts, there's a $14 million industry that you've just potentially shot in the foot. So that's the real concern from DMF. Mass Oyster, I think, has a really interesting approach to try to get a project going in Boston Harbor, as does Anna Maria. One of them is under a very tightly controlled sort of biological educational analysis project, where you've got, as I said, a lot of tight regulation and control around the area to make sure that it doesn't get harvested. I don't want to get into casinos, whether they're good, bad, or indifferent, but Mass Oyster has partnered with Wynn Casino, and Wynn has, with the idea of Wynn restoring part of the Mystic River with oysters. And that project, in my mind, forget the casino part, is a great one to get around this issue of a contaminated area, because there you have 24/7 surveillance monitoring, so you can ensure that nobody's going in there and taking something. And to my mind, we need to do those kinds of experiments so we can start to learn what actually does happen as you restore the habitat. It may turn out that the oysters clean the water up pretty quickly and there's no risk. It may turn out that there's some real serious problems we need to address. I don't think we have good answers, but I think we certainly have to try.
So you don't have coliform in Wellfleet? Is that why Wellfleet is okay to have the oysters there?
Wellfleet's got very, very clean water, but in fact, that Mayo Creek area does have a coliform issue. And the coliform isn't coming from people, it's coming from animals. So you've got, and that's typical of most of the coliform problems everywhere. It's, between birds, dogs, all kinds of the animals that are that don't, use facilities, their coliform bacteria gets washed directly into the water. So in areas where you have high concentrations like that or high runoff, coliform can tend to be a problem. But in Wellfleet, by and large, we only have one area it's that one area that gets closed and then typically gets opened after a period of time, if rainfall has not been if we haven't had a lot of rainfall in a period of time.
You do the shell recycling down in Wellfleet. Do the local
kind of give back to the community and incentivize the program as sponsored and as support?
It's interesting. In North Carolina and other parts, in North Carolina, for example, it's actually illegal to throw out a shell. You can't. You must recycle it. You cannot even use it for your, driveways, as landscaping material. You have to take that shell to a proper recycling center, and they use that all statewide into their recycling programs, and they provide a tax incentive for an amount of shell recycled. In Massachusetts, we have provided an incentive for restaurants on the Cape through our county. We had a county grant to help support this. We gave them about $100 to help with the setup costs and to encourage a bunch of the local restaurants to recycle. And we got about 5 tons last year from a group of restaurants between Orleans and Truro that were recycling and providing shell in Wellfleet. Mass Oyster Project has a recycling program, and they're trying to bring on more restaurants in the metropolitan Boston area. And that's really a fledgling program. And do you want to comment any more about that, Andrew?
We actually have some cards with us tonight, if you want to leave them at a seafood restaurant, asking them to recycle their shell. We're at the stage now, we started off in 5-gallon buckets, then we went to trash cans, then we went to pallets that Terry would recondition, and now we're looking to buy a 24 cubic yard roll-off can. So we're making progress, we're growing, but we would love to get a big major chain like Legal Seafood or Union Oyster House on board with us. We've got a few restaurants and hotels that are supporting us, but we really could take this to the next level, and that's our goal. And we'd love your help.
So you said that oyster reefs mitigate ocean acidification via the calcium carbonate buildup. Isn't that just a localized effect, or does it have any further reaching?
Great question. It actually does. The primary impact is local. You've got a nice buffering in in that water body where you have it. But the other thing that oysters do and shellfish do, and the habitat that is spawned as a result of restoring oyster habitat, so the seagrasses and other things, those are all carbon sequestering materials. So it's been estimated actually that oyster reef and the habitats around it are huge carbon sinks and probably absorbing more carbon than even rainforest per acre. So an extremely effective carbon reducing, carbon mitigating resource. And in fact, as the carbon dioxide increases in the atmosphere, what actually happens is that carbon dioxide gets dissolved obviously in the oceans, and that's what causes acidification. So the things that can take the carbon dioxide out of the water directly are a very efficient way of removing carbon dioxide. So yes, it's more than just the buffering of the TUMs locally. It's also the carbon sequestration that occurs from that habitat. Great question.
My wife and I visited Wellfleet Bay a couple of years ago, and there seemed to be these great flows that were, I understood, was one place oysters were being raised. Is that what those red marks were on your map earlier in the lecture, and how does that compare with the reefs you're trying to build? I mean, it's a little bit different because it's not a whole ecosystem in the float, I presume. Right.
In Wellfleet Harbor, the vast majority of oysters that are raised commercially are raised in structures on the ground.
Are they sunk to the bottom, or are they floating?
Yeah, they're actually sunk to the bottom.
Yes.
And suspended above the bottoms typically. And what's different about it is that you don't get as much biodiversity moving in there. You also don't get you just don't get the nitrogen benefits. When I put up that pie chart, you get about half the nitrogen benefits from that particular kind of activity compared with the natural system, the ecosystem. And you're not going to, they aren't 3D structure that stays in the water year round as potential fish breeding ground, because it's a little bit different. It's all good, but it is a little bit different.
And the industry chooses to do that rather than build reefs because they grow faster, or it's cheaper, or some combination?
All of the above. They typically use hatchery stock. They'll buy seed, grow it out, separated so that the oysters can grow really fast. And that's their method. And protect them from predators and other things. There's one more back there.
How many species of oysters are there, and what is the composition of our current population versus historic population?
In terms of the number of species, there's actually only one on the East Coast. But interestingly enough, it takes on all kinds of different looks, all kinds of different flavors, and you wouldn't think it's the same species, but it's all dependent on the water quality in which it's growing. The mineral content and all those, the kind of sediments that it's growing in, how much salt or fresh it is, all affect the characteristics. And of course, we just simply believe that the Wellfleet oyster is the best in the world. Yeah, that's the native. There are some reports of some invasive species. There's European oysters that are starting to show up in some places. Fortunately, they don't seem to do all that well, so they don't seem to be a real problem. There are some Asian oysters, but the Maine oyster that inhabits from the area from basically Louisiana to Maine is in fact only one species. And what's also amazing is that one species has so many tools in its toolkit genetically to be able to survive in that incredibly wide variety of conditions.
Yes, I recall that the states of Maryland and Virginia were trying to restore Chesapeake Bay area, and one of the proposals was actually put Asian oysters in there, and I think that got shot down by the regulatory agencies. But they were hoping that would be restore the nutrient balance back into the bay. But I guess they're just, right now they must be focusing more on the American oysters.
Yeah, it's a really great kind of question, because the genetics of oysters have changed quite a bit over the years as hatcheries have focused on growing really fast oysters, mainly for the aquaculture industry. There was a study done in Wellfleet Harbor where we looked at the genetics of the hatchery stock compared to the, quote, wild stock. And there really isn't wild stock anymore, because over the last 300 years, there have been die-offs in Wellfleet Harbor. Oysters have been brought in from Long Island. They've been brought in from Chesapeake Bay, from New Haven. Oysters, historically, back in the 1700s, 1800s, even in the early 1900s, they were moved all over the place. So there's pretty much nothing out there but mutt oysters in the wild. But what we did find at this particular study location in Wellfleet Harbor was that the, quote, wild oyster had about 36 alleles. So it had about 36 tools in the toolkit genetically. The hatchery stock only had about 4. So what that means is the hatchery stock was really focused on some very specific expressions of its genes: grow fast, grow plump, grow this way, and it doesn't have a lot of the other things that are in wild oysters. And so when it comes to Chesapeake Bay or Wellfleet or anywhere else, it's another reason why we think it's really important to have local wild stock with this broad set of genetics, because with ocean acidification, with climate change, with all kinds of disease issues, changes in diseases, these things are, things that the oysters are going to have to be able to deal with, and if they don't have the tools in the toolkit, they're not going to be able to.